China's fleet has moved into the Persian Gulf, Chinese troops have landed in Iran, and Washington has just been handed a blunt message. If the United States strikes, it may have to strike through Chinese forces. Not a goodwill visit, not a training exercise, but a shield. By dawn, commercial satellites pick up a strange pattern off the Gulf of Oman, a spearhead formation with destroyers forward, frigates flanking, a replenishment ship trailing, and in the center, amphibious vessels packed with helicopters and sealed containers. Within hours, that formation sits where it matters most, near the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, the world's energy throat. A steel wall placed right at the point where a single miscalculation can ripple into a global recession. And suddenly, the Iran story stops being regional. It becomes systemic, because Iran is no longer just a government. Iran is a switch inside a larger machine. The machine that determines whose factories run cheaper, whose exports win markets, and whose economy survives the next decade of geopolitical shocks. If Washington still believed it could take Iran with a sudden decapitation strike, destabilize the regime, reshape the country, and most importantly, cut off the stream of discounted oil flowing to China, this is the moment America realizes the rules have changed. China doesn't need to fire a shot to win the first round. It only needs to raise the cost of American action to something politically unbearable. That is what this deployment is really doing. It forces a new question inside the U.S. War room. Not, can we do it, but what happens if we do? Because a strike on Iran is no longer a strike on a sanctioned state in isolation. It's a strike in a space where Chinese personnel, Chinese ships, and Chinese interests are physically present, meaning the probability of direct U.S.-China escalation jumps instantly. And markets don't wait for politicians to explain accidents. They price fear immediately. Now step back and look at the motive underneath the theater. Officially, Washington talks about nuclear risk, regional stability, and security. But in a system-level contest, the core objective is colder. Cut the cheap energy line that quietly feeds China's industrial machine. Cheap energy isn't just gasoline. It's electricity, chemicals, plastics, fertilizer, steel, and shipping. It's the cost behind every container leaving a factory. If one economy can secure strategic inputs at a discount for years, it doesn't need miracles. It just needs time, scale, and steady production to undercut rivals across global markets. Over a decade, that cost advantage becomes power. Washington understands this, which is why Iran becomes the thorn America can't ignore. Leave it alone, and China keeps receiving a hidden subsidy that protects margins and stabilizes supply chains. But hit it hard, and the consequences can boomerang straight into America's bloodstream through oil prices and inflation. This is where the story turns bleak, because U.S. power is now tied to domestic pain thresholds. A shock in Hormuz doesn't need to fully shut the strait. It only needs to raise risk, raise insurance, reroute shipping, stretch delivery times, and spike crude. The moment oil jumps, inflation returns, rate cuts die, government borrowing gets more expensive, businesses tighten, consumer confidence breaks, and political polarization accelerates. That's the American crisis. Nobody wants to say out loud, the United States can project military force globally, but it is uniquely sensitive to energy shocks at home because it's a consumption-heavy society with a political system that reacts violently to living costs. And China knows it. So China's ships near Iran are not only protecting Tehran, they are exploiting Washington's internal vulnerability by forcing American planners to calculate domestic backlash before they calculate battlefield outcomes. And notice the elegance of the move. Beijing doesn't have to officially declare it is defending the Iranian regime. It only needs a large visible presence near sensitive infrastructure, ports, coastal facilities, shipping lanes, radar nodes, and suddenly every American option carries the risk of touching China directly. A single drone crash, a radar lock, a collision at sea, a warning shot gone wrong, and escalation becomes a chain reaction. In this new era, deterrence isn't just nuclear, it's the weaponization of accident risk. But here is the deeper question. Why would China take a risk like this at all? The answer is simple and brutal. Because China is already invested too deeply to accept losing Iran, not just in money, but in strategic independence. Iran represents a promise of discounted energy, flexible payment pathways, and supply continuity even when the West tries to isolate someone. If the U.S. cuts Iran off from China, Beijing will have to compete for energy elsewhere at higher prices and higher risk. Higher input costs squeeze export margins. When margins thin, the state must subsidize more to keep jobs and stability. More subsidy means more domestic financial strain, and financial strain is the silent killer of long-term superpower ambitions. Iran is one of the valves that helps China keep that bill lower. That creates the trap for Washington. To slow China, America needs to pressure Iran. But pressuring Iran can trigger the very energy shock that pushes America into domestic crisis. This is the kind of equation that keeps U.S. strategists awake because it reveals something uncomfortable. The United States may still have the strongest military in the world, but it no longer has unlimited political and economic room to absorb the consequences the way it once did. That's why this story is not about who is right. It's about a system where great powers are boxed in by new constraints, where decisions are no longer based on capability alone, but on whether a society can survive the price. In the next part, we will break down 3 layers of American crisis inside this scenario. First, the energy and inflation shock, how even fear around Hormuz can tighten America's throat. Second, the industrial cost war, how discounted Iranian oil becomes a long-term competitive edge for China and a slow lead for U.S. firms. And third, the leverage decay, how the harder America relies on coercion and sanctions, the more the world searches for escape routes, and the more America's own weapon dulls over time. In this scenario, the real battlefield is not Tehran, and it's not even the Strait of Hormuz. It's the American economy itself, because Iran is the kind of trigger that can turn a foreign policy decision into a domestic political collapse in weeks, not years. Start with the first layer of crisis: energy shock and inflation. The Persian Gulf is where global oil risk is priced, and markets don't need an actual shutdown to panic. They only need uncertainty. The moment traders believe shipping lanes might become a war zone, insurance premiums spike, freight rates climb, and refineries begin bidding up crude just in case. Even a short-lived risk premium can push oil higher fast, and when oil rises, everything rises with it. Gasoline, transport, food logistics, plastics, chemicals, airline tickets, trucking, household goods. This is where America's weakness shows, because the U.S. is a consumption-driven society with a political system that treats rising living costs like a national emergency. If inflation reaccelerates, the central bank can't cut rates, credit stays expensive, mortgages stay brutal, corporate refinancing gets harder, consumer confidence breaks, and the mood turns sour. And when the mood turns sour in America, the politics don't calm down. They explode. A single quarter of high gasoline prices can become a full-blown narrative of betrayal. Why are we paying for another war? That's the first trap. The United States can win battles abroad and still lose at home if the price of winning shows up at the pump. Now add the second layer: debt and financial fragility. America's state power is built on its ability to borrow cheaply and indefinitely, because global markets still treat U.S. debt as the closest thing to a safe asset. But that privilege depends on stability and on inflation being contained. If an Iran crisis reignites inflation, yields rise, borrowing becomes more expensive, And suddenly the U.S. isn't just funding a foreign operation, it's funding it inside an environment where every extra dollar of spending carries a heavier interest burden. The contradiction becomes ugly. The more the U.S. tries to project power to preserve its system, the more it inflates the cost of maintaining that system. That is how empires get squeezed, not by one rival's missile, but by the slow math of financing. And in this scenario, China understands that. Beijing doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in open conflict. It only needs to make the U.S. choose between external dominance and internal stability. Now the third layer, industrial crisis, the silent one that doesn't trend for a week but decides the decades. American leaders talk about national security, but beneath the slogans is a brutal reality. Manufacturing is a cost war. If China can consistently secure cheaper energy inputs through a discounted supply line, it doesn't just help a few refineries, it cascades into the entire industrial stack. Cheaper feedstock means cheaper chemicals, cheaper plastics, cheaper industrial heat, cheaper shipping fuel, cheaper electricity in energy-intensive regions, and ultimately cheaper output. That advantage spreads across metals, construction materials, consumer goods, electronics assembly, and every export sector where margins are thin. People think the superpower contest is about aircraft carriers, but the deep contest is about who can produce at scale without choking on costs. If Iran's discounted oil keeps flowing to China, Beijing gets a quiet stabilizer at the very moment the world is fragmenting into blocks. It's not just oil, it's resilience. It's the ability to keep factories running when others slow down. And for the United States, that is a strategic nightmare because America is already struggling with industrial hollowing, supply chain insecurity, and the political pain of losing manufacturing jobs. If China keeps cost advantages, then reshoring becomes harder, because you cannot reshore at a premium and expect voters to celebrate higher prices. You can subsidize, yes, but subsidies are fiscal pressure, and fiscal pressure in an inflationary environment is political suicide. That's the cruel loop. The policies needed to rebuild industry often raise costs in the short term, but American politics punishes short-term pain. So the U.S. gets trapped between economic logic and electoral logic. Now add the fourth layer, credibility and alliance stress. The United States has spent decades building a network of partners that are supposed to follow Washington's lead when crises erupt. But alliances are not built on speeches. They are built on shared costs and shared confidence. If an Iran crisis forces Europe and Asia into higher energy prices, supply shocks, and recession risk, allies start doing what allies always do under stress. They hedge. Some will publicly support the U.S., while quietly looking for carve-outs, exemptions, alternative suppliers, and diplomatic off-ramps. Others will push back against escalation because their governments can't survive domestic protests over energy prices. And every sign of allied hesitation signals to markets and rivals that American control is weaker than advertised. In a system-level contest, perception is part of power. If the U.S. looks unable to impose order without destabilizing its own coalition, then rivals gain room to maneuver. That brings us to the fifth layer, the sanctions weapon and its decay. Washington loves sanctions because they look like control without casualties. But sanctions only work when the target is isolated and when third parties fear punishment more than they value the relationship. In this scenario, China's physical presence around Iran changes the psychology. It signals that Iran is no longer alone and that there is a major power willing to absorb costs to keep the pipeline alive. That makes sanctions harder to enforce and easier to evade. The harder the U.S. pushes, the more creative the evasion networks become. Shadow shipping, reflagging, intermediaries, barter, alternative payment channels, discount trades, backdoor refining. And the more the world practices evasion, the less frightening the sanctions threat becomes over time. That's what leverage decay looks like. Not an instant collapse, but a gradual loss of compliance as more actors learn to live without asking Washington for permission. And here's the most biographical, most pessimistic part. The United States can't easily stop this without escalating into force, because the financial tools are no longer enough when a peer competitor is willing to underwrite the target's survival. So America faces the worst strategic choice imaginable: accept the slow bleed of industrial disadvantage, or gamble on an action that could trigger an energy shock, an inflation spike, and a political rupture at home. Either way, the U.S. pays, either in money, in stability, or in credibility. And that is why this scenario is so dark. It suggests the U.S. is entering a phase where power projection produces diminishing returns and growing side effects. When a superpower reaches the point where every move creates a domestic crisis or accelerates the very system it's trying to stop, it stops looking like a master of the game and starts looking like a prisoner of the board. In Part 3, we're going to go even deeper into the end game. How China can turn Iran into a long-term pressure point without firing a shot. How Washington's maximum pressure can backfire into maximum fragmentation, and why the most dangerous outcome isn't a direct U.S.-China war, but a world where the U.S. tries to regain control through escalating coercion and accidentally accelerates the collapse of the rules that once. Here is the endgame most people miss. China doesn't need to win in Iran the way empires used to win, by conquering territory or installing a flag. In this scenario, China only needs Iran to remain functional enough to keep the energy valve open, and to turn that valve into a permanent pressure point on the United States. That's why the large-scale deployment matters. It's not designed for a glorious battle. It's designed to create a new fact on the water and on the ground. A fact that forces Washington to calculate risk in a way it hates. Because once Chinese ships and Chinese personnel are physically present, the U.S. loses the luxury of clean, one-sided coercion. Every strike now has a second target: escalation itself. And escalation is the one thing the United States can't afford in this arena without triggering the domestic crisis we just described. This is how a peer competitor fights a superpower in the modern era, not by defeating it outright, but by making its options politically toxic, economically destabilizing, and strategically self-defeating. Now watch how the pressure campaign would actually work over months, not days. Step 1 is stabilization of the oil corridor, not with treaties, but with presence. China signals that it will escort what matters, protect what matters, and absorb some of the risk premium that would normally scare shippers away. Even if it only reduces the fear at the margin, that margin is enough to keep flows moving. Step 2 is institutionalizing the discount. China doesn't just buy crude. It structures the relationship so the discount becomes a long-term advantage. Long contracts, flexible shipping, intermediaries, barter-style swaps, insurance alternatives, refineries that are optimized to process that grade, and payment channels that minimize exposure to U.S. enforcement. The public sees oil trade. The system sees something else: an industrial subsidy embedded inside geopolitics. Step 3 is multiplying the escape routes. The more Washington pressures, the more Beijing invests in bypass infrastructure and logistics redundancy, because redundancy is the antidote to sanctions. If the U.S. tightens one channel, the flow doesn't stop. It reroutes, fragments, and becomes harder to trace. This is the ugly secret of modern economic warfare. The harder you squeeze, the more you incentivize creativity, and the faster the target learns to live without your permission. And that's where the American problem becomes existential, because America's strongest weapon is not its navy, it's compliance. The U.S. wins when the world believes it must comply. The moment enough players learn to survive without complying, American power doesn't vanish overnight, but it becomes expensive, noisy, and less reliable. That's the leverage decay nobody wants to admit. Now look at Washington's choices in this endgame, and why they all tilt pessimistic. Option 1 is escalation. The U.S. decides it must break the link by force, either striking Iranian infrastructure, imposing a blockade posture, or enabling regime collapse. But in this scenario, China's presence raises the chance of direct confrontation, and direct confrontation in Hormuz is a nightmare for the U.S. economy. The result is not a neat victory. The result is a risk spiral. Oil prices jump, inflation reignites, rates stay high, debt service costs climb, and political rage spikes. The U.S. can be militarily strong and still be strategically weaker because the cost of action erodes stability at home. That is the imperial paradox. External strength becomes internal fragility. Option 2 is maximum pressure without war. Sanctions, seizures, secondary penalties, financial threats, diplomatic isolation. It looks cleaner, but it carries a different poison. Because if China is committed and physically anchored, pressure becomes a long, grinding contest of evasion and enforcement. The U.S. spends more political capital, more intelligence resources, more diplomatic bandwidth, just to slow a flow that never fully stops. And every round of enforcement that fails to stop it teaches the world a lesson. Washington can punish, but Washington cannot fully control. That lesson is corrosive. It makes other countries more willing to hedge, more willing to test boundaries, more willing to demand exceptions. In other words, maximum pressure can become maximum fragmentation. Option 3 is restraint. The U.S. avoids escalation to protect the domestic economy and focuses on other theaters. This is the quietest option, and arguably the most likely in a society exhausted by costs. But it produces the slowest defeat. Iran remains in China's orbit, the discount persists, the industrial advantage compounds, and the U.S. learns that it cannot easily cut a strategic energy artery when a peer competitor is willing to defend it. That outcome doesn't look like collapse in a headline. It looks like a decade of drift, weaker manufacturing, tougher reshoring, more subsidies, more debt, more polarization, and a foreign policy that feels increasingly reactive instead of commanding. So when people ask, what is the most dangerous outcome here? It's not necessarily a direct U.S.-China shooting war. The most dangerous outcome is a world where the U.S. tries to restore control through escalating coercion, and in the process accelerates the breakdown of the very rules that once made American power feel effortless. Because American power has always depended on a paradox. The U.S. can act globally because the system it leads makes its actions cheap. If that system fractures into rival networks of payment, shipping, insurance, and trade, then U.S. power becomes more expensive to use. Every intervention costs more. Every sanction requires more enforcement. Every coalition requires more bribery, more concessions, more side payments. And when power becomes expensive, democracies turn inward. They demand domestic spending. They punish foreign entanglements. They elect leaders who promise withdrawal or escalation, but never the slow, careful maintenance the system actually needs. This is how a superpower becomes unstable, not from defeat, but from overextension into a world that no longer wants to be managed. In this scenario, China understands the psychological weakness at the heart of the American model. Americans will tolerate many things, but they will not tolerate sustained cost of living pain without political revolt. So China's Iran posture is not just a shield. It's a lever placed directly on America's inflation nerve. And the more Washington pushes against that lever, the more it risks triggering the domestic backlash that makes consistent long-term strategy impossible. That is why this story is bleak. It suggests that the United States is entering an era where it can still intimidate, still punish, still strike, but cannot easily produce stable outcomes without destabilizing itself. And meanwhile, China is practicing a different kind of power. Power that doesn't require speeches, only supply lines. Power that doesn't require moral narratives, only cost advantages. Power that doesn't need to win the argument, only to keep the factories running. Now bring it back to the opening image. Chinese warships near Hormuz, troops on Iranian soil, and Washington staring at a decision tree where every branch leads to pain. That is the real message of this scenario. It's not that America is suddenly weak. It's that the structure of the world has changed in a way that makes American strength less clean, less decisive, and more self-damaging. Iran becomes the mirror that reflects the limits of coercion in a multipolar system, the limits of sanctions against a determined peer, and the limits of empire in a society that can't absorb shocks like it used to. So if you want the final takeaway, it's this. The deployment isn't the start of a war. It's the start of a new equation. An equation where the United States can no longer assume it can cut off rivals by controlling choke points, because rivals are now willing to stand inside those choke points and make every action expensive. And in that equation, the most frightening possibility is not that China wins outright, but that America keeps trying to prove it still rules. And in proving it, accelerates the unraveling of the system that made it ruler in the first place. The rules have changed, the game has changed, and the most tragic part is that the countries caught in the middle won't be Washington or Beijing. It will be everyone else forced to live inside the shockwaves of a superpower that can't afford to lose and a rising power that can't afford to let go, made American power so effortless.